Greetings uniform bob haircuts, and welcome to Codex Compliant.
So we've done a few videos on things that weren't books, so we thought we'd get back to what is in the title of the series that we're doing now.
We're doing the second ed Sisters of Battle Codex.
Foremost amongst the fanatical warriors of the Ecclesiarchy are the Battle Sisters of the Adeptus Sororitas. They constantly guard humanity against the vile hordes of chaos, the insidious threats of heretics, and the assaults of heathen aliens.
One of the most anticipated releases for Warhammer 40,000 is upon us with the release of the new model line for the Sisters of Battle, along with Codex Adeptus Sororitas. The Sisters of Battle are a faction that have not been particularly well served by Games Workshop over the years, if we're being perfectly honest. In the 7 editions of the game that use codices, they've only had 3 that weren't digital only or a White Dwarf article, and that's counting the new one. For reference, the Tau, a race that got their first codex in edition after the Sisters got theirs, have had 5 codexes, and vanilla Space Marines have had 8. In fact, the Sisters have not had a print codex since 2003, and that's not even getting into how old their model line is. Also, considering that for a very long time outside of the Eldar, the Sisters of Battle were kind of the entirety of the female representation in the 40k model line, the fact that they were so underserved didn't look great. However, to celebrate their triumphant rejuvenation, we thought it would be neat to look at their very first codex, which was released in 1997 at the tail end of 40k's second edition.
And before we begin, we'd just like to say a big thank you to Shanus, who generously sent this book to us. Thanks a lot, dude. But yes, let's talk sisters. The Sisters of Battle, sometimes referred to as the Adeptus Sororitas, although the two are not 100% the same thing, but shut up, you know what we mean, are a fighting force made up of all ladies with a religious fervour and a propensity to set things on fire. They've been around for longer than you might expect, too. Not only were they statted in 1993's Codex Imperialis, but they were first mentioned in the original Rogue Trader book, along with an early depiction of their design in Sister Sin, who's taken umbrage with this rainbow warrior for reasons lost to time.
Codex Sisters of Battle is much like the other 2nd edition codices we've covered, and was written by, well, you know.
Take a shot.
The cover is a now iconic piece of art by John Blanche featuring a lone sororitas posing dramatically. To her left are her sisters fighting a presumably nefarious enemy, and to her right are a bunch of crusty old dudes looking like they're trying to figure out a way to take away her reproductive rights. There is also a skull that catches fire when you step on it. There is a lot going on in this image. It's also repeated in full within the book, so you can see even more things going on, like this tiny bat that we can only assume is delivering a message. The main character from this image was also made into a model in 2016.
Lore-wise, well, it's a 2nd edition codex, it's got a lot of lore. It starts with the formation of the Ecclesiarchy, the official church of the Imperium based on worship of the Emperor, going from its origins as multiple smaller forms of worship pre-heresy to it being formed into a major organisation by a man known by the alias of Fatidicus, which is a real Latin word that means prophetic. It's also a word that you really do need to look up a pronunciation guide for before saying in a YouTube video.
Anyway, the Temple of the Saviour Emperor, as it was then known, helped control the not fun kind of anarchy that had gripped the Imperium post-heresy, gradually gaining more and more power and becoming the Adeptus Ministorum, otherwise known as the Ecclesiarchy. Eventually this led to the Age of Apostasy, where they bickered and warred with the rest of the Imperium. Basically, a lot of people died for very silly reasons. Long story short, in the aftermath, the Ecclesiarchy was forbidden from keeping any men under arms, so much of their fighting force was disbanded. However, due to the specific wording, they kept their all-female fighting force the Daughters of the Emperor, which would later become the Adeptus Sororitas, a part of which are the Sisters of Battle. So yeah, the entire faction exists solely due to a small print technicality, which we think sums up the Imperium pretty damn well.
And that's just one chunk of the fluff in here. Later on, there's a several-page segment dedicated to the current Ecclesiarchy and its structure, and another on the Plague of Unbelief, a particularly bad time within the already bad time that was the Age of Apostasy. The most famous bit of that is when ecclesiarchal forces besieged the Space Wolves' home planet of Fenris, which goes about as well as you'd think it would. So if you're looking for a book on background fluff of the Ecclesiarchy, this one ain't a bad place to start. There's also an interesting part about how Space Marines and the Ecclesiarchy don't exactly see eye to eye, since although Marines are loyal to the Emperor, they generally don't think of him as a god, and also aren't really human anymore.
How can any self-respecting confessor or cardinal relate to a monstrous giant who can spit acid or crush a man's skull with one hand and practices crude acts of blood sacrifice?
The solution is that they just agree to disagree and don't bother each other unless absolutely necessary. I expect being able to spit acid and the skull-crushing thing makes it a bit easier for people to just leave you alone.
But what about the armies you can make with this book? What are the actual playable units? Well, there's not a whole lot, which I suppose is understandable since this was the first Sisters Codex. The complete list of units available is Canonesses, Veteran Superiors of both the regular and Seraphim varieties, Missionaries, Confessors, Preachers, Battle Sisters, Seraphims, and Fraterus, I should look this up. And Fraterus militia bands, with rhinos and immolators making up their carpool. Going by the beta codex we got in chapter approved 2016, since at the time of writing this video the new codex isn't actually out yet, all these units are still playable now with the exception of Confessors and Fraterus militia bands. Confessors were there to berate the faithless and advise those in power. On the tabletop, they and any squad they led were subject to an unrestrainable version of frenzy, which meant that they were immune to all other psychological effects like fear or terror, but must charge at an enemy within range and, amongst other things, couldn't parry since they are simply too worked up to think about fancy swordplay.
Oh, and because the version of Frenzy that Confessors had couldn't be controlled by rolling 2d6 and comparing it to their leadership, it means that they were less controllable than, I don't know, Khan the Betrayer?
Fraterus militia bands, on the other hand, were simply militias rallied to arms when needs must. They're also technically not part of the ecclesiarchy, so they can be men, it's fine. They were fanatical, cheap, and came in large numbers. Basically, they're the imperial version of chaos cultists. They're just cannon fodder for a different flavour of fanaticism. Since they were often taken from the civilian population, their weapon tech is not quite up to the standards you might expect, with weapons like bows and muskets being available for those that wish to use them.
Since all the units available in here are limited, it states that armies made using this book are primarily designed for use as allies for other Imperial forces. You can run them as a full army, of course, but it's just not primarily designed with that in mind. They also have a separate allowance for allies themselves. You see, with the majority of 2nd Ed 40k armies, you could spend 50% of your points on support units. Support units are things like vehicles and artillery, but also include any allies from other factions. The Sisters, however, got 15% to spend on rhinos and immolators and 25% for allies from other Imperial forces. However, they had less restrictions on how those allies were formed. So if you wanted to have nothing but Space Marine chaplains to make up 25% of your army, then sure, you could do that. Regarding special characters, it's a similar story to many other books from this era, with some of the characters still present today and some having disappeared without a trace. Still around now we have Uriah Jacobus, Missionary and Human Hedge, and, well, that's it for playable characters still around. Actually, we don't even have Celestine in here. She said, bitterly. Instead, we have Saint Praxedes of Ophelia 7, a canoness who was famous for hitting Tyranids with her fancy mace, the Sceptre of Vengeance. Helena the Virtuous, who was less of a warrior and more of a powered armor tactician with a Crozius. Redemptor Kirinov, who is not, in fact, a type of dreadnought released decades after this codex, but a terrifyingly efficient confessor who is very proud of this picture of a skeleton he's drawn. And Cardinal Armandus Hellfire, a well-liked cardinal who we want you to know is described as huge. He is a huge man with a powerfully muscled body and a deep, booming voice.
Another novel thing in here are the sacred rites. At the start of a battle, certain characters leading units can pray and gain an added buff for themselves and their squads. To do this, you roll a d6, apply the relevant modifiers, then consult this chart. Some of the effects are minor, like being immune to fear and terror, all the way up to once per game being able to fire their ranged weapons for a second time in a turn. Although that last one does involve a few modifiers being present to be able to get, unless you have a non-Euclidean d6 that can roll a 9, I suppose. This codex also has a couple of pages given over to explaining how to use the immolator tank, as after all this is a pre-3rd edition codex, so you're damn straight it's more complicated than nowadays. The tank can shoot with a focus fire using 1 flame template, or it can do a wider, less powerful shot using 2. You also roll a d6 for models hit but not slain by the attack, and on a 4+ they are set on fire, which then leads to another roll where a result of 1 to 5 would cause additional damage as well as making them run around in random directions and not be able to shoot. You know, on account of being on fire.
Looking at the war gear you can choose, there's a fun selection of relics ranging from the Cloak of Saint Aspera that adds +1 to your armor save, to the Blade of Admonition that causes fear in its opponents by showing them their true face, all the way to the Tears of the Emperor, vials of tears collected from statues of the Emperor that, when thrown like grenades, cause massive damage to demonic enemies. Yes, statues of the Emperor sometimes cry, it's not weird, why you gotta be weird about it, it's fine, yeah.
Looking at the models in the colour section, the selection shown is pretty slim, which is unsurprising considering the small selection of units. Actually, a small thing of note here is that the painted versions of the sisters from the Order of Our Martyred Lady, which is the colour scheme you usually see sisters painted in, have their robes painted mostly black rather than red as most modern depictions do.
Also, in the colour section of the book, there's a page by John Blunt showing various conversions you can make for your ecclesiastical forces, interestingly showing illustrations rather than photos. These conversions use bits of Warhammer Fantasy and Necromunda, as well as 40k parts, and it's fun to try and figure out where the parts come from before reading the descriptions. Although considering many of the models in question here were made of metal in 1997, even the relatively simple head swaps would be a bit of a bugger to actually pull off compared to doing it today. Also, one of the characters is called Corvus Corax, which raises a few questions.
And that was the 1997 Codex Sisters of Battle. It's pretty neat. At 64 pages, it's a little bit shorter than the average 2nd edition codex, but it is chock full of interesting background information, and it doesn't have those catalogue pages at the back like most of the others. It's also a little strange to see a Sisters army list that doesn't contain many of the units you expect, like Repentia, Exorcists or Penitent engines. Plus, seeing models that were, until recently, the current Sisters line in their original 2nd edition context is kind of fun.
Although, to be frank, the best thing about this book is that by writing a whole video about it, I can finally type out the word ecclesiarchy without getting it wrong.
Could you spell it for me now?
I would prefer not to.